What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and this is A Point and Focus, the live stream, episode 11, 10, 11, I think it's 11, maybe 10, I think it's 10, of Season 3. This is the episode for Friday, March 5th, 2021. And today, on the list of things that I'm going to briefly talk about, I want to talk briefly about the last 2 weeks' episodes, just kind of very briefly. I'm going to try and make this episode pretty darn short. Some new rumor or some canon rumors stuff, and the changes to filming requirements in the national parks in the United States. So I want to kick this off by talking briefly about engineering, because I realized something after last week's episode, which is, at least in my case, doing the engineering is way more interesting than talking about the engineering. Or, well, I find the engineering interesting, but I also find it's very difficult to make it interesting to talk about or interesting to look at, especially when you're talking things theoretically and whatnot. And so, as a result of that, I have decided that I'm going to stay away from doing that as much as I possibly can until I can figure out a way to, unless that's something that's like super interesting, or I can figure out a way to present it more interestingly. Because essentially 3 hours of talking about math and computers is kind of, well, let me put it this way. The 3 hours talking about it was far less interesting, in my opinion, even to me as the person who was interested in who was doing the talking, was far less interesting than the almost 20 hours I put into doing the work on that, including all the software that I ended up writing and so on and so forth. So for those who are turned off by the fact that last 2 episodes of the live stream were hugely long, in-depth technical engineering things, you don't have to worry too much. I'm not going to be doing a ton of those. So, moving on to the first thing that I wanted to talk about, which was a rumor from Canon Rumors that a new menu system is going to hopefully maybe be coming to Canon's cameras. And I gotta say, that would be nice. One of my complaints, one of the things I talked about in my video of things that I'd like to see Canon fix in the EOS R5 is the fact that their generally good menus have turned into a absolute mess of just stuff. It's not consistent. Things are kind of all over the places. There's little bits of, there's hoops and things that you have to jump through, and you can actually clearly see the like entire historical lineage of things that as Canon has added features to the camera, as certain things are done the same way they were done when they were probably originally implemented like 10 plus years ago, or 15 years ago even, maybe. Other things are done in a way that they were probably done when they were originally implemented, say 10 or 7 or 8 years ago, and then some things are done in a completely different way as they've been implemented now. And there's not nice, consistent, a coherent consistency of going through that whole thing. My complaints have less to do with things being difficult or cumbersome and more to do with the fact that it's very inconsistent, and in some places that things could be improved, but otherwise, yeah, a new menu system or an update to the menu system would definitely be something that I would appreciate. Again, maybe not a completely new menu system, but certainly some cleaning up, some overhauling, some consolidating, some making things less all over the place kind of thing would be definitely appreciated. Unfortunately, the odds are that something like that will happen in a new camera, and it won't happen in existing cameras that, really could actually use it too. And, a lot of this problem here with this really comes down to the fact that the cameras are becoming increasingly more complicated. The more stuff the camera has to do, the more complicated it is, the more complex the menu systems have to be, or end up being. And, you know, there's kind of, in some ways, there's no way around having complicated menus. The trick is to have a complicated menu that conveys things efficiently to the user and is efficient to navigate and use. So the other thing on the rumor list is Canon had a CR0 article of rumored specifications for the EOS R1 professional mirrorless camera. And, you know, CR0 on Canon rumors means basically not, it's not confirmed. It's basically just don't buy it, pretty much, is, I guess, the best way to put it. And just looking at the numbers, I mean, yeah, I know Canon Rumors is a rumor site. They have to publish rumors, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, just looking at the numbers, there's definitely a level of, they're going to publish it because it's a rumor. But there's a lot of things in it that I find telling that I would believe don't necessarily make sense. And I know I wasn't going to talk about cameras and engineering, or engineering, too much, but I think this is not an engineering thing. This is more of a use in photography thing. So I wanted to talk briefly about a couple of things here. So they're saying an 85 megapixel sensor. Now, Sony obviously went to a 40 or 50 megapixel sensor with the Alpha 1. Nikon is talking, I believe, about a 45 megapixel sensor in the Z9, which would be their professional camera. The problem, and certainly if you look at the EOS R5, Canon does have the processing power to do at least a 45 megapixel sensor at 20 frames a second with an electronic shutter. So there's certainly more room for more processing. There's more room for, I mean, we're not like, this isn't, the processing cameras isn't so bleeding edge that they're pushing the limits of absolute, you know, credibility with a 45 megapixel, 20 frame per second camera. It's entirely feasible or possible that Canon could come out with an 85 megapixel camera that will shoot 20 frames a second. The question that I run into with all of this is why? What's the purpose? What's the value that it's delivering to the customer? Because, you know, I'm not sure that Nikon and Sony at, you know, obviously the Z9 hasn't, I don't think, been completely announced. My memory on that is a bit foggy, but certainly the Alpha 1 has been announced and released or whatever. That I'm not 100% convinced that 45 megapixels at 20 or 30 frames a second is a desirable thing for the market in question. That you start talking about, especially when you start talking about other factors. So ignoring, like I said, for a second, ignoring frame rate, the rumor was talking about an ISO range of 160 to 1.6 million. And I've applauded Canon for ignoring this stupid, as I feel, or that I feel stupid, let's have some ridiculously high ISO number. 3 million, 2.1 million. The only camera that Canon makes that does really high ISOs is a full HD, full frame, so it has massive pixels, massive photo sites, special purpose video camera. It's not something that's in the realm of normal standard still cameras. And one of the problems that we have seen, and one of the problem, period, is you just can't get around physics. Physics is a cruel mistress, and physics puts hard limits on what you can do. And, you know, we've seen like in the case of Nikon, who decided they really wanted to have this big number to put on the box to market the cameras. ISO 1.6 million in the case of the D500 and ISO 3.2 million in the case of the D6 and D5. And the way they got there, and this is also ignoring the fact that those cameras have much larger photo sites than an 85 megapixel full sensor or full frame camera was, somewhere on the order of 16 times bigger for the roughly 16 times bigger, I think, for the D6, and 4 times bigger for the D500, assuming you know I did the math right on that when I wrote my notes. But Nikon got to these really high ISOs by basically letting the floor drop out. And in my experience with the images that I've seen from those cameras at those really high ISOs, and the images that I've helped photographers who have those cameras that were trying to get the high ISOs tuned in just as part of the overall process of setting up their camera in Lightroom, the results were basically unusable. And this is even down to like news photographers who basically like run into lots of situations where having a picture is more important or more valuable than having a good picture. And they still, after all the work we did to tune the images, they still basically said, I can't use these settings, and just turned them off and hard capped their cameras at much lower values. And so I'm dubious of, you know, as good as Canon sensors have gotten with the dual pixels and the on-chip conversion and whatever they're doing now to be essentially competitive with Nikon and Sony in terms of, you know, performance across the board, I'm dubious that they can get a 1.6 million ISO out of an 85 megapixel full frame sensor that doesn't essentially just produce crap image quality. I don't see that happening, and I don't see where the efficiencies can be made at the engineering level to make that happen. So sensor technology right now is already approaching a quantum efficiency of 50%, and I don't see doubling that, which would be a quantum efficiency of 100%. Like, I don't see that happening. Pixels are smaller, so the surface area is smaller, so the pixels capture less. Read and conversion noise is already down in the 1 electron range for most good sensors or most manufacturers. That maybe could be suppressed a little, but I don't see it being able to be suppressed a lot, or at least substantially more. And so I don't see this as being a useful thing if this in fact is true. And I'm sort of on the betting side that this maybe isn't true. Canon has seemingly demonstrated, because they certainly could have pushed digital processed ISOs, they certainly could have pushed things out well beyond the range of what was what they were doing, the 800,000 with the 1DX Mark III, that you know, had they wanted to for marketing reasons, they, you know, could have easily gone to 1.6 million on that camera, potentially letting the floor fall out or letting the bottom fall out and saying, you know, we don't care what the minimum image quality is, here's a big number. And they didn't do it. And Sony isn't doing that either, as far as I can tell, looking at their cameras. The Alpha 1, I think, tops out at 800,000 or something like that, which is pretty much the standard for professional cameras right now. And functionally, you know, and this is the discussion that I going back to when Nikon announced the D5 and had the really high ISO numbers, and the testing started coming out that if you drop the floor out to just put a big number on the box, it doesn't help photographers. And it doesn't, I I think it's a very bad move from a marketing position because it doesn't really sell uh, photographers either. Sure, you might get the people, like, I mean, this is the problem, is these are cameras, and cameras, like most consumer electronic devices, can be tested. And you could say, well, there's only so many options, and if you're, say, Canon, you're selling cameras, Canon professional photographers are only going to buy, or buying Canon cameras. They may switch brands or whatever, but there really only is one EOS 1, whether it's mirrorless or DSLR or whatever. And if you want the EOS 1, that's the camera you have to buy. And that's true to an extent. But the same token is you can really harm the there isn't, I guess I shouldn't say you can harm. The flip side is you don't have to be like, ridiculous marketing numbers don't matter. It's not a selling point the way it is in, say, smartphones or something like that, where selling a high frame rate, whatever, to the, competing in the consumer electronic space. Either you're providing a feature, high ISO capability, whatever, that is a feature that's useful to the users, or you're providing something that is neutral, or you're providing something that, in providing it, is harmful. And in the case of, for example, the Nikon D5 and D6, I would argue that their ISO 1.6 million and 3.2 million are more harmful than neutral. Yes, you don't have to use them. However, if you do use them for whatever, you basically end up with nearly an unusable or untenable image. It's just not, like, it's not really the image. There's so much noise, the image quality is degraded so badly that it's actually hard to make out what it is you're looking at. And so you have a number on the box that says it can do this, but then you're providing a photographer with a function that actively sort of works against their goal of capturing an image, or I think that's kind of what I'm saying. It works against the goal of capturing an image, or doing so safely. We talk, Canon gets blasted for or got blasted for the thermal limits on recording in the EOS R5. Canon has been blasted in the past for things like the autofocus system. If you put an f8 lens on the camera and the autofocus system didn't have f8 capabilities, the autofocus system just shut down. So if you had a teleconverter or whatever to get, and you had an f8 combination, you just had no autofocus system. And the position that Canon was operating in had very much been, if we can't guarantee that it'll work properly, it's better to not allow anybody to do anything. It's better to stop the photographer or put the photographer, like, be very clear this isn't going to work, than it is to, well, here, this kind of maybe may work in certain circumstances if you have the right subject or the right lens. And I mean, not that I feel like I bag on Nikon a lot, but I mean, this is a perfect example, I think, of the sort of problem that I see with these, like, super high ISOs. Now, if for some reason Canon could actually get to that and have it be a good enough image to be usable, that would be really impressive. But on the same token, like I said, I'm dubious that they could actually get to that without running into the same physical limits that everybody else is. But anyway, to the story that I was getting to tell. Back when I first started in photography, I mean, I shoot Canon. I have friends who shoot Nikon, and we went out shooting, and on my cameras, if I put a teleconverter on an f5.6 lens, because this was late 2000s, 2007, 2008, I was shooting with a 40D at the time. If I put a teleconverter on, I lost the autofocus system. No autofocus whatsoever. The camera just turned it all off and said, I can't do it, no autofocus. And I wasn't super paying attention to like Nikon stuff or whatever. So I was out shooting with a friend, and I was borrowing one of his Nikon D2X bodies, D2XS, something like that. Uh, and a 500 f4, just to play around with. Like I said, I was new to all of this stuff, and some teleconverters. And so if I put a 2x teleconverter on the 500 f4, it was f8, and the problem that I would run into is that the autofocus system in the D2XS couldn't focus with an f8 lens and teleconverter combination. Now, I didn't know this at the time because it was all borrowed equipment, and I didn't spend an awful lot of effort, or time beforehand, like doing a lot of research. This was just going out for some fun, shooting with some gear, playing around, basically. Like, this wasn't a serious thing. And we were shooting an eagle or something like that, and I'd shoot, and sometimes, I'd go to focus, and sometimes the Nikon would hunt, and okay, that's a little weird, but whatever. And sometimes it would seem like it would lock on to autofocus, the focus would lock on. I'd get the focus confirmation light, and I'd go take some pictures, I'd shoot some pictures, and I got home, and, of course, it's the D2XS, it's a DX camera. The viewfinder's not real big. The viewfinder on, all DSLRs is optimized for brightness. It's not optimized necessarily to show you the accuracy of focus. The D2XS predated live view, so you couldn't put the camera in live view and do that kind of, focus there. So I was just relying on what the camera was telling me. And I got home, and basically every picture I shot with the 2x teleconverter on the D2XS was out of focus. And now, I was bummed, but I wasn't just like, didn't ruin my life on Nikon or something like that, because, well, it's not that important. And it wasn't like this was a critical shoot that I absolutely had to get right. But it did set forward an idea in my, in how I think about things, which is, if you can't deliver good results, if you're a camera manufacturer and you can't ensure good results, don't let me do it. And I was kind of annoyed that Canon wouldn't try to focus or anything if you didn't have, if you had this non-compatible thing prior to this. But post this, I realized I'd much rather the camera say nope in something that doesn't work fully well, or can't guarantee that will work, than a camera that kind of goes, well, here, I'll try it, and maybe because of the right interactions of the right things out in the world, the autofocus sensor thinks that it's in focus, or something like that. It goes ahead and it says, yeah, just, do this, whatever, you're good. Like I said, I under stress, which something that can happen in, a number of situations, my preferences, I've realized from experience, is that it's better to have something fail in a very obvious way, so that that it's not going to work, or it's not going to be good enough, than it is to have something that is maybe there, or maybe usable, or maybe you can go look at something. And, this is, like I said, this is where I come back to the whole thing with like high ISOs, super high ISOs, these million 1.6, 3.2 million ISO settings. Is the quality actually there? Or would this be another thing, an example of like where Nikon with the D5 and D6 said, we can get a big number if we let the floor, the bottom, drop out and just have at it. And, you go look at DxOMark, you go look at Photons to Photos, and you see dynamic range scores for the D5 and D6 at these super high ISOs that are they're less than a stop of dynamic range. You know, if you ever have the opportunity to shoot with these cameras, you get images where it's hard to really tell what you took a picture of. At least that's been my experience, and I just I don't want to see Canon go down that road just, well, because they can or something like that. And in fact, based on this, the rumor, again, CR0 rumor, so it's not possible at all, or it's completely wrong at all. I feel like the whole ISO range that was given in the rumor is shifting the wrong direction. It's shifting up. So the lowest setting went from 100 to 160. The highest setting went up a stop from 800,000 to 1.6 million compared to like the 1DX Mark III. And like I said, I feel like it should be going the other way. It should be going from 50 to 400,000 or 50 to 800,000, not almost 200 to 1.6 million. And I'm not, I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me, because everybody I've ever talked to who's a sports photographer is like, I don't want an 80 megapixel camera. I don't want a 40 megapixel camera. Because they have to deal with a lot of images to get the right image. They want high frame rates and they want enough resolution. They can make prints, or they can put it in a magazine, or they can, send it off to their wire service. Transmission time becomes a thing. Even with 5G, if you're sending bigger pictures, they take longer. It takes longer to edit. It takes longer to process on a laptop in the field. Everything in like photojournalism, in sports photography, it's go, go, go. And, or a lot of it is, I won't say everything. And so you start talking about, well, you're going to have huge images, which are slower to process on a computer, that take longer to transmit, just so you can have a big high resolution sensor. Functionally, I guess, it's, like the technology certainly would allow it, I think, or it could be developed to allow it by the time, in the, for such a camera. But if you're going to put like an 80 megapixel or 85 megapixel sensor in a camera, it seems to me like your target is studio photographers and your target is landscape photographers. In which case, for landscape photographers, at least going on my own experience in this, I want a lower maximum ISO or minimum ISO. I'd like to shoot at 50 instead of 100. And I mean a real 50, not a artificially expanded 50. So my artificial or my digital ISO would be 25 instead of 50. I certainly wouldn't want to be going up. I wouldn't want to be going to 200. I wouldn't want to be going to 160. And doing high resolution or doing like action sports stuff, even for like wildlife, well, I guess one of my problems is I'm not even sure what the point of an 85 megapixel, how valuable an 85 megapixel sensor is to start with. There's diminishing returns on image quality in in resolution in cameras, and I'm seeing it big time with the R5, because for me, in my experience with the R5 so far, is that going from 30 megapixels in the 5D Mark IV to 45 megapixels in the R5 doesn't make pictures 50% better. It's 50% higher resolution, but it doesn't make the pictures 50% better. And where, like, when I had a 5D Mark III and a 5D Mark IV, and I almost never wanted to use the Mark III because the jump in resolution and image quality from the Mark III to the Mark IV was sufficiently high enough that the images were more than 50% better, even though there was about a 50% increase in resolution. Going from 30 to 45, I'm not seeing that kind of improvement in image quality. There's some. I'm not saying it's just as good or it's not better, but I'm not seeing a dramatic jump. And I'm not convinced going from, say, 45 megapixels in a R5 to 85 megapixels in an R1 is going to deliver, or would deliver, that dramatic of a jump, either to the point where it compensates for all of the other sort of drawbacks. So image size, how hard it is to process, the computational intensity, and time it takes to do all the work on computers, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that's kind of really, when it comes down to it, what I wanted to talk about that rumor. Again, it's a CR0 rumor on Canon Rumors, so it's probably completely wrong, barking up the wrong tree. Just some guy's wild speculation that he's probably thrilled to see somebody talking about it, or see Canon Rumors talking about it. I don't see anything within the realm, or outside the realms of possibility, in terms of something that couldn't be done in in what they're talking about. But on the same token, I see a lot of things that really don't make sense to me as a thing. And so I'm going to jump real quickly for a brief moment to talk about my last thing, which is changing regulations for for filming in the national parks. I'm not going to get in. I'm probably going to talk about this again next week when I have time to do a lot more research on it. I just saw a thing on it today and started digging into the requirements and the permits, and who needs permits, and what things are, and what the actual laws say versus what the press releases say, and so on and so forth. But it does look to me like it's good news for essentially YouTubers and independent filmmakers. So previously, if you were shooting video, and this is the regs for video and still photography are separate in the national parks. But previously, if you were shooting video in the national parks that you intended to make money off of, it made it a commercial use, and you had to have a permit. And it didn't matter what you were doing, and it didn't matter what equipment you were using, you had to have a permit. And this is well, I'll get into that. Like I said, I think I'm going to talk about this in more depth next week. So what has changed is filmmakers who are using basically still camera equipment, or low impact equipment. Whether you're doing commercial or non-commercial work, don't need a permit anymore. So if you're a YouTuber who makes their living off of YouTube, for example, previously you would have needed a permit to shoot a video for your YouTube channel where you were talking about how awesome the national park that you were in. And it didn't matter, you were making money. It didn't matter that you were holding your cell phone out or using a selfie stick and a GoPro. If you were making money off of it, you needed to have a permit and pay the fees. And now that no longer applies. So if you're shooting on your cell phone at arm's length for your YouTube channel that you make money on, you don't need a permit now. If you are using a selfie stick, you don't need a permit now. If you are, well, a caveat to that, which I'll come back to. If you're shooting with a mirrorless camera, or a DSLR, or a hybrid camera, or potentially even a cinema camera on a small tripod, you don't need a permit. Caveats to this. It doesn't apply in wilderness areas. What a wilderness area means here is very specific. It is not, well, I'm just out in the woods, so this is the wilderness. The regulations governing areas that are designated as wilderness areas are different from the regulations governing areas that are designated as just national park land. So for example, there is no wilderness area in Yellowstone National Park. It doesn't matter where you go in the park. There is no federally designated wilderness areas inside the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. So you can hike some trail into the backcountry where there's more bears than people, and you're not in a wilderness, a designated wilderness area. Conversely, for example, in Yosemite National Park, basically, if you are not in the Yosemite Valley area or the immediate area around the Hetch Hetchetty Reservoir, that almost all of Yosemite National Park is a designated wilderness area. And so the regulations are different there from the just general national parks. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this, but I also want to talk about this after having done a lot more research on it. Because the reality is, it's complicated. Like almost everything in life, there is no simple, easy, here, there, whatever. But anyway, so if you were filming, and I keep saying filming because this only applies to filming, it doesn't apply to still photography. The good news, though, being is if you go look at the regs, still photography that was basically you with a camera and a tripod never required a permit in the national parks anywhere, at least according to the laws and regs that I have seen. If you were using models, if you were using props or scenery or potentially weddings where you had a disruptive influence or you needed a crew, that was a completely different story. But if you were just a landscape or wildlife photographer and you were in a publicly accessible area of the park and you were generally would have normally been permitted to be there and you shot stills, you could shoot in a national park without a permit. Anyway, so yeah, low impact filmmaking is now actually basically, like I said, on par with the situation with still photography. If you're from what I can tell. Now this is also interim. This is interim guidance. So the deal was there was a lawsuit against the National Park Service for the commercial filming permits for essentially if you didn't have it, that it was a freedom of speech issue, that they were not regulating based on the impact to the land or the resource. They were regulating based on whether you were doing something for fun or doing something for profit. And it was found that they couldn't do that. And so, like I said, this changes things. Again, interim guidance, there will be more defined. Right now, everything's a little nebulous because the way this all works is the court rules that what the Park Service was doing was illegal or unconstitutional in this case, and the Park Service has to adapt. And like they can't well, okay, well, we're going to just keep doing what we're doing and then wait for a period of comment and rulemaking and blah, blah, blah. They have to adapt. Essentially, the old rules were struck down by the court, and the Park Service had to provide interim rules on what the situation could be. So these are the interim rules. I will put a link to the National Park Service page in the description for this. In fact, let me do that right now. Because that makes sense. So this is the official page for the National Park Service's film and still photography permits. The link's in the description. It is this applies essentially to all parks. And this is the result of the guidance, and it explains the situation, I think, better than the press release that the National Park Service issued. But, it's a press release. It's supposed to be simple and sort of to the point or straightforward or whatever. But like I said, I see this as good news for us if you're a YouTuber or a small independent filmmaker that, isn't doing this kind of crazy... well, I mean, here's a perfect example. I follow the skier Cody Townsend on YouTube, and he's doing the 50 project where he's skiing the 50 classic lines in North America. And his he's documenting the whole thing, and he's documenting it essentially with body-mounted GoPros, and his cinematographer Bjarne is shooting with a DSLR or a mirrorless. From what I've seen in the behind-the-scenes stuff that they've put out, essentially he stands somewhere and videos Cody and whoever he's skiing with skiing, and the impact of the cinematography aspect is essentially zero on the land compared to the impact of them actually being there and skiing, because they're going to be there and ski. And last year, I think it was Mount Rainier, they were granted the permits to the backcountry to do the ski on Mount Rainier, I think, but they weren't granted a photography, a videography, or a filmmaking permit. Even though the filmmaking was the three of them who were going to be skiing there anyway, shooting GoPros and not doing anything they otherwise wouldn't have done. Under the new regulations, as far as I can tell, they never would have had to even apply for a filmmaking permit unless they were in a wilderness area, which again is a different thing. It's actually held to a higher standard with higher requirements. And that's one of the other reasons I want to be able to do some more research on this, because those requirements for wilderness areas, I'm trying to find what the actual requirements and law are, because it's not even really clear to me what the situation is, that governs that. What public laws, code of federal regulations, etc., govern photography in a wilderness area versus in just plain national park areas. But anyway, like I said, as a YouTuber who would potentially be making something in a national park that's commercial, this is definitely, I think, would be considered commercial, because if you're monetizing it on YouTube, it becomes commercial under the definitions used by the federal government and the Park Service. Not taking a crew, not closing down part of the park, not trying to get access to something somewhere that isn't, otherwise not publicly accessible. Like I said, I would no longer need to apply for a permit for the video, for shooting video, just as far as I can tell, I never would have had to apply. Again, reading the regs, I never would have had to apply for a permit to shoot stills. Nice. I think that's a nice thing, more or less. Anyway, like I said, I'm probably going to be talking about this again next week when I can have some time to really sit down and dig into the regs and laws and the whole shoot match with what's what and what's the next thing, and especially, like I said, questions about what laws govern wilderness area versus other things, and so on and so forth. So that's going to wrap up this episode. I actually have run a little bit longer than I really intended to. I was trying to make this a short and sweet episode for the sake of trying to not be like last week's 2-hour monster. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you're into this kind of thing, talking about photography, videography, whatever, please consider subscribing. I'm trying to get back to working on regular videos as opposed to just doing live streams. I'm desperately trying to get back to the project I've been working on to go through and do a really in-depth look at the EOS R5. I just keep running into roadblocks with trying to figure out how to shoot it, and I should just say, I'm going to shoot it, and it is what it is, but on the same token, I want to meet my own personal standards for that. So I'm working on it. It's coming, but, it is what it is sometimes. So anyway, again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.